Edward walked cautiously through the icy streets of Silverpine, his heavy boots crunching against the snow-covered pavement. Max, his loyal Labrador, trotted beside him, his golden fur dusted with snowflakes. As he approached a desolate intersection, the peaceful stillness was shattered by the screeching sound of tires losing grip on the frozen road. Edward turned just in time to see a car spinning out of control. It slammed into a streetlight with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass and metal into the night. Max barked furiously as Edward rushed toward the wreck. Before he could reach the vehicle, the doors burst open. 2 children stumbled out, their cries piercing the night. Each boy clutched one side of a small carrier, and through the mesh Edward glimpsed a white cat trembling inside. The boys, barely 10 years old, looked at Edward with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Help us, please!" one of them sobbed, his breath hitching. "Mom won't wake up." Edward's heart clenched. "Stay here," he said firmly, motioning for the boys to stay by Max. "I'll check on her." The front of the car was crumpled like an accordion, steam rising into the frigid air. Edward forced the driver's door open, his hands trembling as he found the woman slumped over the steering wheel. Her dark hair was matted with blood, and her face was pale against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "Mom, can you hear me?" he asked, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered open for a moment, and she whispered something barely audible. "Protect my boys." Her words were faint but desperate. Edward nodded, pulling out his phone to call for help. Within minutes, the blaring sirens of an ambulance echoed through the quiet streets. Paramedics worked quickly, lifting the unconscious woman onto a stretcher. One of the boys ran toward her as they loaded her into the ambulance. "Mom!" he cried, his voice breaking. The other boy clung to Edward's coat. "Don't let them take her. What if she doesn't come back?" Edward crouched to their level, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "She's going to the hospital to get better. You'll stay with me for now, all right?" The boy nodded reluctantly, his grip on the cat carrier tightening. Edward led them to his nearby car, Max jumping into the back seat as if sensing the urgency. As the vehicle warmed up, Edward glanced at the rearview mirror. The boys huddled together, clutching the carrier, while the cat inside mewed softly. He didn't know their names yet, but their faces, framed by identical tousled brown hair, struck a chord deep within him. Something about them felt achingly familiar. Though he couldn't place why, the snow fell harder as Edward drove toward his mansion on the edge of town. The massive house, once filled with laughter and life, had grown cold and silent in recent years. But tonight, as the headlights illuminated the long driveway, Edward felt a flicker of warmth. Perhaps this house too was ready to welcome someone new. The grand oak doors of Edward's mansion creaked as he pushed them open, the warmth from inside spilling out into the frosty night. Max bounded in first, shaking off the snow that clung to his fur, while the boys hesitated on the threshold. Their small hands still gripped the cat carrier, their eyes scanning the cavernous interior with a mix of awe and apprehension. "Come in," Edward urged, his voice soft. "It's warm in here." The boys exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The warmth hit their flushed cheeks immediately, and they relaxed slightly as the scent of wood smoke from the roaring fireplace filled the air. Snow, the white cat inside the carrier, let out a low meow. One of the boys opened the latch, allowing the feline to leap out and land gracefully on the polished wooden floor. The cat sniffed the air before curling up near the fire, as if claiming the spot as its own. Edward hung up his coat and watched them, noticing how they clung to each other like two halves of a single being. Their identical features, a mop of brown hair, almond-shaped eyes, and a slight dimple on the right cheek, stirred something deep within him. It was as if he'd seen them before, though he knew it was impossible. The resemblance was uncanny. "What are your names?" he asked, crouching down to their level. "Liam," said one boy, his voice steady but cautious. He pointed to his brother. "And he's Lucas." Edward nodded. "I'm Edward. This is Max. He's very friendly." At the sound of his name, Max padded over and nuzzled against the boys. Earning a small, reluctant smile from Lucas, Edward led them to the sitting room, where he handed them warm blankets and mugs of hot cocoa. The boys sat close together on the couch, their hands wrapped around the steaming cups. Snow had already claimed a spot on Lucas's lap, purring softly. "Your mom will be okay," Edward said after a moment, his tone reassuring. "She's in good hands now." Liam looked up, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Are you sure?" Edward hesitated. He wasn't sure, but he couldn't bear to say it. Instead, he gave a firm nod. Yes. Later, as the boys fell asleep on the couch, their small bodies bundled under the blankets, Edward found himself drawn to the cat carrier they had left near the fireplace. Inside was a small notebook, the pages slightly crumpled from use. He opened it carefully. His curiosity piqued. The first page was filled with crude sketches of a small, weathered house. The next page had the words "Dear Grandpa" scrawled in uneven handwriting. Edward's heart skipped a beat. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through more pages, finding more drawings of a man with a kind face, standing outside the same house. The resemblance to himself was unmistakable. Edward stood frozen, the notebook in his hands, as questions flooded his mind. Who were these boys really? And why did they feel so familiar? Determined to find answers, Edward decided to visit the site of the accident the next morning. Something about the boys' presence, their uncanny resemblance to someone he couldn't yet place, and the mysterious notebook whispered of a connection he couldn't ignore. As the fire crackled softly and Max curled up at his feet, Edward gazed at the sleeping children. For the first time in years, his mansion felt alive again, but with that life came uncertainty. A storm he knew was only just beginning. Edward parked his car on the side of the icy road where the accident had occurred the previous night. The faint morning light filtered through the grey clouds, illuminating the shattered glass and skid marks left behind. The scene felt hauntingly quiet, as if the snow was trying to erase the evidence of the tragedy. Max sat patiently in the passenger seat, his ears perked up, watching Edward's every move. With determination, Edward followed the clues he had pieced together from the boy's notebook. The drawings of a modest house and the mention of Grandpa gnawed at him. He navigated the winding, snow-covered roads outside Silverpine until he spotted it, a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. Smoke barely trickled from the chimney, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Edward approached the door, his boots crunching in the deep snow. He knocked twice. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a cold, dimly lit interior. Through the gap, he saw a few sparse pieces of furniture and a thin blanket draped over a worn-out couch. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through him. There were signs of children here, a pair of tiny snow boots near the door, crayon drawings tacked to the wall, and a few scattered toys. He turned back toward his car, a lump forming in his throat. The boys had been living here in these conditions. His mind raced with questions, but one stood out. While later at the hospital, Edward stood beside the unconscious woman's bed. Her face was pale but peaceful, her breathing steady under the hum of the machines. The nurse had informed him she was stable, though it might be days before she fully regained consciousness. Edward didn't know why, but he couldn't leave without answers. Just as he was about to turn away, her eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment, she looked startled, then resigned. "Who are you?" she whispered hoarsely. "My name is Edward. I've been taking care of your sons," he said softly. "They're safe at my home." The woman's eyes widened, filling with tears. "Thank you." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Edward hesitated before speaking again. "I need to ask you something, your sons. They mentioned a grandfather, and there are drawings of someone who looks like me. Can you explain that?" She looked away, her hands clutching the blanket tightly. "I didn't want you to know," she murmured, her voice cracking. Thomas is their father." Edward staggered back as if the words had struck him physically. His son, his Thomas, the boy he had buried 10 years ago, is. His chest tightened, a flood of emotions washing over him. Grief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of loss all over again. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was sharp, but his eyes betrayed the anguish he felt. She wiped her tears, trembling. "I didn't want anything from you, I thought. After he died. It was better this way. I didn't want anyone to think I was trying to take advantage of you. I just wanted to raise them quietly, on my own." Edward clenched his fists, struggling to compose himself. "And what about the boys? Did you think about what they lost?" Her silence was answer enough. Edward turned away. His heart heavy with a mix of rage and sorrow, he walked out of the hospital without another word, leaving the woman to her guilt. That evening, back at the mansion, Edward sat in the dimly lit library. The boys were playing with Max and Snow in the adjacent room, their laughter echoing faintly through the halls. He stared at an old photograph of Thomas on the mantelpiece, his mind a storm of memories. The boys weren't just strangers. They were his blood, his family, and he had missed a decade of their lives. As he placed the photo back on the mantel, Edward made a silent vow. He would not lose them again. The frost-laden morning seemed cruelly bright as Edward stood at the grand entrance of his mansion, watching Emily step out of the taxi. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she approached. She had come to take the boys back. Inside, Lucas and Liam were seated on the rug by the fireplace, playing with snow as Max watched them intently. The house, which had been so silent for years, now echoed with the sound of their laughter. But today, that laughter felt tinged with sadness, a bittersweet melody Edward wasn't ready to let go of. Emily entered the room hesitantly, her eyes scanning her sons. They looked happy, safe, and for a moment doubt flickered in her gaze, but then she straightened her back, determination returning. She called out to them softly, her voice firm yet tender. "Boys, it's time to go." The words hung in the air like a sharp gust of wind. Lucas froze mid-laugh, his hand resting on Snow's back. Liam turned toward his mother, confusion clouding his face. "Why?" Liam asked, his voice small. "We like it here." Edward stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Emily," he began, his voice calm but pleading. "Don't do this. They've only just begun to feel safe again." Emily's gaze hardened. "They're my children. Edward, I've raised them on my own and I will continue to do so. I won't let them get used to something that isn't permanent." "It doesn't have to be temporary," Edward said, taking a step closer. "This is their home too. Let me be a part of their lives." Emily shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. "So you don't understand. I've seen what wealth and privilege can do to people. I don't want them growing up thinking the world owes them something." "This isn't about wealth," Edward countered, his voice rising slightly. "It's about family. They've lost so much already, don't take this from them." The boys watched the exchange silently, their young faces etched with confusion and fear. Snow jumped into Lucas's arms, sensing the tension. Max let out a low whine, circling Edward protectively. "I'm sorry," Emily said finally, her voice breaking, "but we're leaving." Liam burst into tears, running to Edward and wrapping his arms around his waist. "I don't want to go," he cried. Lucas hesitated for a moment before following, his small hands clutching Edward's sleeve. Edward's heart felt like it was being torn in two. He knelt down, holding both boys close, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Emily stood by the door, her face crumbling as she watched the scene unfold. Her resolve wavered, but she quickly turned away, calling the boys once more. "Come on!" Reluctantly, the boys pulled away from Edward, their tear-streaked faces full of heartbreak. Snow mewed softly as Lucas tucked the cat back into its carrier. Edward stood motionless as they walked out the door, the sound of their small footsteps fading into the snowy morning. The silence that followed was deafening. Max nudged Edward's hand with his nose, sensing his sorrow, but it did little to soothe the emptiness now consuming him. For weeks, the house felt colder than ever. Edward avoided the library where the boys had played and ignored the toys they had left behind. Even Max seemed subdued, often sitting by the front door as if waiting for their return. Late one evening, Edward sat alone in the study, staring at the drawings the boys had left in the notebook. Each stroke of crayon felt like a fragment of a life he'd never known he wanted. He traced his finger over the word grandpa, written in a child's uneven handwriting, and felt a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't give up, not on them. The heavy silence of Edward's mansion was broken one stormy night by a frantic knock at the door. Max, ever vigilant, barked loudly, startling Edward from his somber reverie in the library. He rose quickly, his heart pounding as if it already knew what awaited him. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him stole his breath. Emily stood there, her face pale and streaked with tears, her clothes soaked through from the storm. She clutched Liam in her arms. The boy's face was flushed, his small body trembling with fever. Behind her, Lucas held Snow's carrier, his own face pale with fear. "Please," Emily choked out, her voice breaking. "He's burning up. I didn't know where else to go." Without hesitation, Edward stepped aside. Ushering them in, he reached for Liam, carefully taking the boy from Emily's trembling arms. The child's skin was hot to the touch, his breaths shallow and labored. Edward's heart clenched as he carried him into the living room, laying him gently on the couch. "Call the doctor," Edward instructed his butler. Who had appeared at the commotion? He turned to Emily, his voice steady but urgent. When did this start? Yesterday, she admitted, wringing her hands. I thought it would pass, but it only got worse. I couldn't afford to take him to a hospital. Edward swallowed the surge of emotions her words evoked. Anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sadness for what she had endured. You did the right thing bringing him here, he said firmly. The doctor arrived within the hour, administering medication and fluids to bring the fever down. Edward sat by Liam's side the entire time, his hand never leaving the boys. Emily hovered nearby, her guilt evident in the way she avoided Edward's gaze. By morning, Liam's fever had broken, and his breathing was steady once more. Edward let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, relief washing over him. Lucas, who had refused to leave his brother's side, finally allowed himself to sleep, curled up on the couch with Snow purring softly against him. Emily sat across from Edward, her hands gripping a cup of tea he had offered her earlier. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression weary. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. I've been wrong, she said quietly. About everything. Edward didn't interrupt. He let her continue, sensing how much it cost her to say those words. I was so afraid of what your world might do to them, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I see now that keeping them from you wasn't protecting them, it was hurting them. Edward leaned forward, his voice gentle. Emily, all I've ever wanted is to be here for them, for you if you'll let me. We can do this together. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. They need you. I need you. The weight of those words settled over them, a fragile but hopeful truce forming in the space between. For the first time, Edward saw not just the fear in her eyes, but also the love she had for her boys, a love strong enough to bring her back here, to him. In the weeks that followed, Emily and the boys stayed at the mansion. What began as an arrangement of necessity slowly grew into something deeper. Lucas and Liam brought life to the halls that had long been silent, their laughter a balm to Edward's soul. Emily too began to soften, allowing herself to trust Edward and accept his presence in their lives. One snowy afternoon, Edward walked through the town square with Lucas and Liam. Snow nestled in Liam's arms while Max trotted ahead. Emily watched them from a bench nearby, a rare smile lighting up her face. Edward glanced back at her, a sense of peace settling over him. For years, Edward had thought his life was over, that his wealth and mansion were nothing but empty symbols of what he had lost. But now, surrounded by the warmth of family, he knew the truth. His life had only just begun. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Edward, Lucas, Liam, and Emily in The Twins in the Snow. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story of love, redemption, and family, don't forget to click the card above to explore more captivating tales like this one. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. I love reading each and every one of them. Let's keep the conversation going.